Now, this talk started out when Catherine said to me, you know, it might be a nice idea if you did a bit more on the geology of churches. And so I thought, well, let's start by continuing my road trip and go on from Beer to Portland. But it somehow morphed rather from there, because when you start to talk about Portland stone, you cannot but help think of St. Paul's. And I think that I've got both this week and next week now to talk about the building of the current St. Paul's Cathedral. Well, on the portico of the south transept, there is a phoenix. And the legend underneath Resurgam means I will arise. And indeed, the current St. Paul's Cathedral is one which has arisen not from just one old St. Paul's. To talk about St. Paul's, it's a bit of a misnomer, old St. Paul's, because we know that there were at least 4 previous cathedrals on the site. Earlier ones dating from 604, 675, 962 and 1087. And so before we look at Christopher Wren's new St. Paul's Cathedral, I want to look a little bit at what it replaced. Now, you will remember, or you may remember from last week, we saw this graffito from about 1400 at St. Mary's Church, Ashwell. And this particular drawing is thought to be of Old St. Paul's in London. And if it is, it's an incredibly rare survival in any medium. But as you look at that, if you can just be aware of the rose window that you've got there, and also St. Augustine's Watling Street, which is just to the east of the drawing there. And compare that with a drawing restored from ancient authorities, which was published in the Builder in 1892. And once again, you can see St. Augustine's Watling Street there, the same rose window, and certainly to my mind, there's little doubt that that graffito really is a drawing of St. Paul's. This building, the Norman Cathedral of St. Paul, was built on the site of the Saxon church, which burnt down in 1087. And that next version of St. Paul's actually took 240 years to build. It was the largest landmark in the medieval city. It measured 650 feet from east to west, 325 feet from north to south. Old St. Paul's was actually larger even than the Wren building which replaced it. In this print here, you can see the Gothic east end, and in the middle there is St. Paul's Cross, which was an open-air pulpit at the site of the London Folkmoot. It was also the focal point for all London's printers and bookmakers. But St. Paul's Cross was removed in 1635 when this part of the cathedral precinct became the mason's yard during Inigo Jones's renovation works on the cathedral. This, other than the graffito, is the oldest known drawing of Old St. Paul's, dated to about 1540. However, of this huge and graceful cathedral, as Inigo Jones's pupil John Webb termed it, little has survived following the Great Fire of 1666. With the exception of a few fragments, only the tomb of John Donne is intact and stands now in Wren's new St. Paul's. And here you can see Nicholas Stone's 1631 monument to John Donne. It depicts the poet standing upon an urn, dressed in a winding cloth, rising for the moment of judgment. And this depiction was John Donne's own idea, sculpted from a painting for which he posed. But I preferred to put up the miniature from the Royal Collections Trust rather than the original painting from which the memorial was made. Now, you may not realize it, but for a brief period, Old St. Paul's was actually the tallest building in the world. That was after the spire of Lincoln Cathedral fell down in a storm in 1549. But St. Paul's held that record for only a short period of time because St. Paul's own spire was lost to a lightning strike on February the 1st, 1561. And I quote from a contemporary source: "Between 1 and 2 of the clock at afternoon was seen a marvelous great fiery lightning, and immediately ensued a most terrible, hideous crack of thunder, such as seldom hath been heard, and that by estimation of sense directly over the city of London. Divers persons in time of the said tempest being on the river of Thames, and others being in the fields near adjoining to the city, affirmed that they saw a long and spear-pointed flame of fire run through the top of the broach or shaft of St. Paul's steeple from the east westward. And some of the parish of St. Martin's, Ludgate, being then in the street, did feel a marvellous strong air or whirlwind with a smell of brimstone coming from St. Paul's Church. Between 4 and 5 of the clock, a smoke was espied to break out under the bowl of the said shaft. And suddenly after, as it were in a moment, the flame broke forth in a circle like a garland round the broach, and increased in such wise that within a quarter of an hour, the cross and the eagle on the top fell down upon the south cross aisle." Unfortunately, I couldn't find a photograph of that lightning strike on St. Paul's, but I did find a rather remarkable one from 7 years ago. Now, I've put this print up here because it shows an important element in the rebuilding of St. Paul's, the wharves and the steep hill up to the site. And this print also still shows St. Paul's with its spire pre-1561. But I have been struck as to how many drawings there are, illustrations of the old St. Paul's, which are compiled from old drawings and prints. But I have tried, as far as possible, to use the contemporary sources. Another important factor when rebuilding the new St. Paul's was actually London Bridge, as we shall see later. Here we have this wonderful long view of London by an etching by Wenceslas Holler, who had spent some time in London in the 1640s. Left London to escape the ravages of the Civil War. And this particular etching was based on sketches which he had drawn from the Tower of St. Saviour in Southwark. But he returned to London in 1652, where he remained until he died. And here you can just see that area with St. Paul's magnified. Now, in 1658, Sir William Dugdale's History of St. Paul's was published. This was towards the end of the Protectorate, after the death of Oliver Cromwell, by which time his son Richard was proving a very ineffectual leader. And William Dugdale published this in order to record the building in the face of the damage caused by parliamentarian troops during the Civil War, to help preserve one of the most eminent structures of that kind in the Christian world, and to give some representation as well to the present age as future times of what it hath been. Several histories of St. Paul's have been written, but this work by Sir William Dugdale stands out, both for the fortuitous timing of it and the brilliant evocative illustrations by Wenceslaus Holler, which accompany the text. And these record the appearance of the cathedral and give some hint of its former glory, and also the work done in the preceding years, shortly before the Civil War, by Inigo Jones. And here you can see what Inigo Jones had visibly done. He had produced a new portico at the southern end. And he had also recased here the tower of the parish church of St. Gregory by St. Paul's. Inigo Jones was actually forced to keep the church after much protest when he began to demolish the church. But all Inigo Jones's work stopped at the outbreak of the Civil War in 1642. So here we see a ground plan. Again, this is one of Wenceslaus Holler's engravings of the old church. It was finished, the main body of the cathedral was finished by 1314, having been started in 1087, but the church was continuously amended and expanded due to its role as the mother church of the City of London. By the Reformation, it had become the largest church in England, but its lavish interior was destroyed by Protestant reformers in the reigns of Henry VIII and Edward VI. And many of the outbuildings and former chapels were sold off to become shops and houses. Sir William Dugdale, an antiquarian fascinated by ecclesiastical history, was commissioned by Christopher Lord Hatton to produce the book just 10 years before the Great Fire of London destroyed the building. It started with a chance meeting in the street between the two and led to the loan of vast numbers of deeds and other documents which enabled Sir William Dugdale to compile his history with great accuracy. And the cathedral he describes was at the heart of London life, a meeting place of ecclesiastical, public, regal and civic parts of society. And here I'm just looking at one of the tombs inside, that of St. Erkenwald, Bishop of London, who died in 693, which stood on the east side of the high altar and was famous across Europe and a very popular pilgrimage destination. And another illustration by Wenceslaus Holler, this is of the Convocation House, the chapter house. In the 1660s, it was actually an empty shell, both the floor and the roof having fallen in. But this site here was to become Wren's centre of operations during the first part of the rebuilding of the cathedral, because this area was easy to secure and was guarded by 2 mastiffs kept by the Clerk of Works. A new office, 2 stories high, was built on the west side of the yard, that's up here, in March 1667, and was used as living quarters and a store for expensive building materials, and with a drawing office on the first floor, keeping records and models. But by the time of the restoration in 1660, St. Paul's was in a very sorry state. Cromwell had used it for barracks and for stabling horses. There were worries about the stability of the by now nearly 600-year-old structure. And Charles II saw that rebuilding St. Paul's presented a great opportunity to re-establish the authority and dignity of the crown. In 1661, he sought advice on the stability of the building and, among others, turned to a gifted young professor of astronomy, one Christopher Wren. At that time, Wren was Professor of Astronomy at Gresham College in London, but was appointed to the civilian professorship of astronomy at Oxford by the King later that year. A royal commission was formed in 1663, and in 1664 they collectively reached the conclusion that the tower needed to be demolished forthwith. And the impetuous Webb, who was on the commission, a pupil of Inigo Jones, immediately started collecting timber for scaffolding. But the commission took fright at the likely cost, sought a second opinion from one Roger Pratt, who was currently building a handsome mansion for the Earl of Clarendon. And Pratt recommended that the old building could be patched up. Probably a more realistic project financially, but nothing more happened in that year. Now, at this time, 1665, Wren was in France, lectures having been suspended in Oxford because of the plague. So he spent nearly 9 months in France meeting various scientists, and clearly had been inspired by the exciting new architecture he had seen being constructed all over Paris. And he brought back bundles of architectural engravings of French and Italian buildings. On Wren's return to London, the commission asked him to prepare yet another report. He was damning of the suggestion for saving the tower. He favoured demolition, but put forward an ingenious proposal for building a new tower and dome around the old, only demolishing the old tower structure from within when the new had reached a sufficient height to be impressive. His design, and this is that design was presented to the commissioners on August the 27th, 1666, and after much discussion was accepted. The only obstacle left to starting work was finding the money. But just 6 days later, disaster struck. Starting on Sunday, the 2nd of September, the Great Fire burned over 5 days to Thursday, the 6th of September, 1666. Now, remember I talked about St. Paul's Cross being a focal point for the bookselling and printing trade. And tons of books from surrounding printers and booksellers were quickly shifted into the crypt of St. Paul's for safety from the fire. It was actually a very curious situation. St. Faith's parish church had been demolished in 1256 to make way for the Gothic eastward extension of the cathedral. But the parish church still existed, although now it was in the Undercroft and known as St. Faith's under St. Paul's. And that was the Stationers' Company Church. So it was the obvious place for putting books and paper and flammable things into safe storage. But on the Tuesday night, the scaffolding around the tower began to burn, then the roof caught light, and the books in the crypt caught light as well. From that moment, the building was doomed. In the course of those 5 days, it's estimated that 13,200 houses and 87 parish churches, 6 consecrated chapels, 52 livery halls, the Guildhall, the Royal Exchange, the Customs House, Newgate Prison, and 3 city gates were all destroyed in an area of 373 acres. between 880 and 100,000 people were now homeless. But quite remarkably, only 6 people are known to have died during the fire. And then the finger pointing started and was done in various ways. And I was just struck by this, on the ruin of Christian religion, undermined by unchristian practice. And it was another Wenceslaus Holler engraving which adorned the front cover. But at this stage, I think we need to look a little bit more at the people involved. So Wren was born in East Knoll, Wiltshire, in October 1632, and was named after his father, Christopher, who was the rector there. Now, at that time, the rector's brother, Matthew, was Dean of Windsor, before being elevated to be Bishop of Hereford and later Bishop of Ely. On being elevated to Hereford, Bishop Wren persuaded the Crown to appoint his brother as the new dean. And significantly with that came the residence in Windsor Castle. Thus, young Christopher spent much of his childhood in Windsor Castle, and being just 18 months younger than the young Prince Charles and a year older than Prince James, I think it is absolutely inevitable that they got to know each other. They would all have been going to church every Sunday, and small boys running around after the service, at the very least, would have got to know each other. However, by the time Christopher was 10, the Civil War caused considerable upheaval. It meant that his father lost the residence at Windsor and had to move back first to Knoll and then to other places. But all this movement brought Christopher Wren, into contact with various scientists and mathematicians. And he gained, first of all, an interest in sundials and then astronomy. By the time Christopher went to Wadham College in Oxford in 1649, he had acquired a very thorough grounding in geometry, anatomy, astronomy, Greek, and Latin. And he also knew a surprising number of the leading scientists of the time. He was clearly an outstanding student. 4 years later, in 1653, on receiving his MA, he was immediately elected a Fellow of All Souls College. And then just 4 years later, in 1657, only aged 25, he was chosen as the Professor of Astronomy at Gresham College in London. His range of interests was, quite frankly, astonishing. He carried out some of the first ever intravenous injections, produced a theory for the rings of Saturn, wrote a mathematical proof for the rectification of the cycloid. That's the point which is drawn, which is traced out when you look at a point on the circumference of a wheel as it rolls. He invented various devices for surveying, built a number of musical instruments, invented some methods for underwater construction, underwater navigation, and experiments in printmaking, to name but a few. After the Restoration, early in 1661, the king commissioned him to produce a model of the moon and to create a book of engravings of observations through a microscope. This latter he then entrusted to his very close friend, Robert Hooke. And it seems that it was Hooke and Wren who together first came up with the idea that gravity followed an inverse square law. And Wren then persuaded his friend Halley to approach Newton to actually find a proof. By this stage, Wren was also showing a lot of interest in architecture. And in 1662, his uncle Matthew, now Bishop of Ely, commissioned a new chapel at Pembroke College, Cambridge, which was built to designs by Christopher Wren between 1662 and 1665. The chapel was dedicated by Bishop Matthew on St. Matthew's Day, 21st of September, 1665. And when he died 2 years later, he was buried in the chapel vault. And Wren's design model for the original, for the chapel in Pembroke was discovered in the organ loft in 1923. Nowadays, it can be seen by those select few who can get into the senior parlour. The model clearly had a removable roof, which sadly is now lost. But this is the first of many, many models which Wren either constructed himself or had constructed, because using a model was one of the prime ways of actually being able to instruct people when they were building a building. So here we are looking at the inside now of Pembroke Chapel. And as we are seeing it now, it's not quite as it was originally built by Wren, because the east end has been moved 1 Baysworth east in 1880, when George Gilbert Scott expanded the chapel. But other than that, it is still largely as built by Wren. The plaster work is exquisite in the ceiling. The carving, though simpler, is exquisite too. That is, except for the graffiti which we saw last week. Another early Wren building was the Sheldonian Theatre in Oxford. Commissioned by Gilbert Sheldon, Archbishop of Canterbury, it was built to Wren's design between 1664 and 1669. The facing stones of the Sheldonian came from a quarry near Burford, owned by one Thomas Strong, master mason. And it was probably during the building of the Sheldonian, or possibly some lodgings in Trinity College, also built to Wren's design at about this time and using the same stone, that Wren first met and got to know Thomas Strong. Wren's design for the Sheldonian was based on the open-air theatre of Marcellus, erected in Rome in the 1st century BC. But 17th century Oxford was not ancient Rome, and the theatre needed a permanent roof. The span of this D-shaped roof was over 70 feet, and no timbers existed that were long enough to cross that sort of distance. Wren dismissed the obvious solution of a Gothic roof, and instead he decided to use a geometrical flat floor grid developed 20 years previously by an Oxford professor, John Wallis. And that involved creating a series of trusses which were built up from shorter sections and held in place by their own weight, with help from judiciously placed iron bolts and plates. So effective was the roof that for nearly a century, the Oxford University Press stored its books up there, in the roof space of the Sheldonian. And for many years, this was actually the largest unsupported floor in Europe. In 1720, surveyors inspecting the roof, following a rumor that it was no longer safe, were both surprised and impressed at what they discovered. Although the ceiling was sagging slightly from the massive weight of books stored up there, the inspectors pronounced that the whole fabric of the said theatre is, in our opinion, likely to remain and to continue in such repair and condition for at least 100 or 200 years yet to come. But at this point, I think I must turn back to St. Paul's. And here I'm looking at stained glass window in St. Lawrence Jewellery, in a window tucked away in a vestibule at the back of the church, which reminds us that Wren may have been the mastermind, but that he was far from the only person who must be remembered in the building of St. Paul's. Just look at the T and the set squares there being held by the cherubs. I think this window is a fitting tribute to those who built and rebuilt the Wren churches in London, and especially St. Paul's. The Church of St. Lawrence Jewry, built by Wren 1670 to 77, was almost destroyed on a raid, air raid on the 29th of December 1940. It was restored in 1957, hence the stained glass window. And it's now the official church of the Corporation of London. I especially note Edward Strong here, master mason at St. Paul's from 1681 to 1714, having taken over from his brother Thomas, who, if you remember, was the master mason and the quarry supplier of the stones for the Sheldonian. And his brother Thomas had actually laid the first stone of St. Paul's on June the 21st, 1675. And the lower scene depicts actual people involved with the rebuilding of St. Lawrence Jewry: labourers, carpenters, plasterers, stonemasons, and two of Webb's stained glass craftsmen. And the quotation in the middle comes from Isaiah 58:12. And they that shall be of thee shall build the old waste places. Thou shalt raise up the foundations of many generations, and thou shalt be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of paths to dwell in. How appropriate a quotation. But we have had the fire. What on earth are we going to do now? Just 6 days after the fire, Wren sought an audience with the king, bearing a design for rebuilding the city. The authorities actually very quickly concluded that the redistribution of plots implied by Wren's new square grid layout would be much too complicated. But nonetheless, it had clearly signalled his interest. Very shortly afterwards, the Bishop of London and the Dean sought his advice again, and he delivered his report early in 1667. The Bishop and the Dean had sought for advice on building a temporary building within what remained of the choir, so that services could resume quickly. But Wren was very dismissive, saying that such a building would be in danger from a collapsing tower. He suggested that a temporary roof could instead be erected over part of the nave, but was generally very unenthusiastic, saying it would be like mending the Argo Navis. Scarce anything will be left at last of the old. But despite Wren's dismissive advice over putting in a temporary building, the commission actually issued an order for the erection of a temporary choir in the nave and for walling in of the site in January 1668. However, by April, the whole idea had been finally abandoned due to further structural collapses, and Wren was called urgently to London to give advice. A royal warrant was issued in July 1668, allowing demolition work to begin. And in August, the commissioners ordered that the remaining parts of the choir and tower should be demolished. At this point, John Denham, surveyor of the king's works, was ordered by the king to make Wren his deputy. Denham died shortly after, and Wren immediately became both surveyor of the king's works and shortly afterwards, on 30th of July 1669, surveyor of the fabric of St. Paul's, a role which he had in effect been doing for several years and would remain in until his death. Now, note in this drawing from Thomas Wick, there is as yet no fence or wall around the site, but here in this other print which I have found, It must be slightly later because we now do have a wall in place. During all the discussions about shoring up the old building, there had been a general concern that the church would not be able to afford a new cathedral, and that when it could, it would have to be considerably smaller. Money was clearly always seen as a potential problem. Anyhow, with walling and fencing around the site, the old cathedral needed to be demolished before anything new could be built. Unfortunately, pictures of the demolition works of St. Paul's are few and far between. These are the best I could find, and they relate to an application made in 2008 to demolish the new cathedral as a protest against the British company's plan to extract bauxite in India. But these underline a serious point. Clearing the site was hard work and produced a lot of rubble that would need to be reused when building the new cathedral. Rubble to be stored and kept away from pilfering hands which might want to use that rubble in other building works. In September 1667, masons had already been paid to suspend themselves from ropes to knock down any masonry that appeared to be in danger from falling from the vaults. And a wall was built to provide security for any recyclable materials. It also meant that all labourers had to pass through the works office in the Convocation House yard. And the surviving accounts list every labourer by every day of attendance in this period. Between the start of this demolition work in 1667, even before the royal warrant had been issued, and 1673, demolition being the most dangerous time for the whole project, there were 3 deaths and 3 serious injuries. The cathedral paid surgeons' fees, compensation to injured men and to widows, and funeral expenses to those who died. During the main construction period from 1675 to 1715, there were just 6 deaths. I find this incredible. The death rate is actually lower than one would expect from a similar project today, even with all our health and safety legislation. By 1671, the tower had been reduced to the level of the great arches over the nave, but the huge piers that had supported the tower there were a real problem. Wren constructed a huge A-frame to support the battering ram that was operated by 30 people. I'm afraid to say that once again, I couldn't get a contemporary picture. This is the closest I could find, which is from 1888 of the Kilrush evictions in Ireland. But you can see there a frame carrying a battering ram, which was used to knock down walls. When Wren started with this battering ram, it took 2 days of continuous battering before the first pier started to fail. So Wren decided on more drastic measures. Seeking advice from a gunner at the Tower of London, Wren instructed labourers to dig a hole beside the northwest tower down to the foundations. And they then tunnelled into the centre of the pillar and placed a deal box with 18 pounds of gunpowder. The hole was then bricked up and the gunpowder set off. Those who were watching saw the whole column rise 9 inches before crashing down. 18 pounds of gunpowder had lifted 3,000 tons of masonry and done the work of about 1,000 working man days. 2 more pillars were successfully demolished in the same way. But the last pillar was demolished by the assistant surveyor when Wren had been called away on the King's service. And the assistant surveyor was said to be too wise in his own conceit. He did not dig deep enough or brick up properly and used much more powder. The pillar exploded so violently that a huge piece of masonry shot across the churchyard and smashed through the window of the upper floor of a nearby bookshop. Miraculously, no one was killed, but the accounts for 1672 list a considerable expenditure for repairs caused by this rogue explosion. And Wren was forbidden to use any more gunpowder and had to revert to the use of the battering ram along the walls and the pillars of the nave. But at the same time as demolition was going on, so new designs were being produced. The earliest surviving design of Wren's is known as the first model design and dates from 1669. A wooden model was made, taking 3 months to build, at a cost of £250, 15 shillings. And Wren was also paid 100 guineas in gold for his efforts. The accounts show that £2 was paid in April 1670 to transport it to Whitehall to show to King Charles. It was returned 2 years later, but the transport cost was then only £1, 10 shillings, presumably because the missing and probably the more interesting part of the model stayed in Whitehall with the king. During this time, Wren made a number of other designs. Most dramatic was the Greek cross design. This may have been inspired by early designs for St. Peter's in Rome, which he had learnt about while in Paris. It was symmetrical, with 3 of the 4 sides containing entrances, and the last, the eastern side, containing the altar and a circular choir. This was approved by the king in November 1672, and an order was issued the following month to build a model, such that a man might stand within it. But before work could start on model building, Wren's fertile mind had added a library vestibule and a West End portico. Now, I must say that we are fortunate that an immense wealth of documentation survives, not just the accounts for the building of St. Paul's, but there are 68 drawings at All Souls, Oxford, and 220 still owned by the Cathedral, but now stored in the Guildhall in London. It was this modified plan, known as the Great Model Design, that was actually constructed as a model. It took about 18 months to complete. It's scaled at 1 to 24, in other words, 1 inch equals 2 feet. The model itself is 13 feet high, 13 feet 1 inches wide, and 20 feet 11 inches long. And it was made at a total cost of just over £500. Although made of wood, both the interior and the exterior were plastered and painted, and finally finished with £5 worth of gilding, and trente d'oeil painted vaults and 18 miniature statues. But immediately criticism flooded in. The chapter and some of the other clergy thought it not enough of a cathedral fashion, to instance particularly that the choir was designed circular. But perhaps the greater concern really was that the choir was within the dome, so could not be built separately and before the rest of the building. Since financing of the venture was so uncertain, it was held to be essential that the building could be done in stages, and being able to complete the choir first was an imperative. So back to the drawing board, and Wren finally hit on a scheme which appeared to meet all the conflicting demands. Submitted to Whitehall early in 1675, it was approved by royal warrant on the 19th of May, and the foundation stone was laid just over a month later on June the 21st by Thomas Strong. Note a number of things like the equally spaced bays and the flat roof line. Looking at this external, note that there are no screen walls, as you see in the present building. You can see the aisle roofs and the clerestory, and there are no flying buttresses. More of that later. But here we have the original ground plan for the warrant design. Here now, this is the final ground plan of St. Paul's, onto which I have overlaid the original. And you can see how, in particular at the West End, there is a significant difference, and also how the squared off porticos at the north and south transepts in the original Warrant design have been significantly remodeled. So the starting pistol has been fired on the 21st of June, although it took until 1711 to be declared officially complete. And actually work carried on until the 1720s. So I think at this point it might be helpful to put up a timeline. You've got a number of changes of monarch, but Wren, as I have said, I think knew both Charles II and James II quite well from his childhood. And so a few significant dates. We start the rebuilding in 1675. It was actually, that's 9 years after the fire. It's 31 years after the fire before the first service is actually held in the new cathedral. And it's 45 years after the fire before it was officially complete. Over that time, how much did it cost to build? The final entry in the accounts calculated by that by 1716, it had cost £804,758. The stone alone had cost £90,314, nearly 12% of the total cost. Although the total amounts actually shown as passing through the accounts was over 1.1 million, perhaps £1,000 million in today's money. Where did the money come from? Coal had long been taxed, and an additional levy was placed on coal in 1667. And with the Rebuilding of London Act in 1670, St. Paul's had a share of that income. Once there was this promised taxation income, it enabled loans to be taken out, secured by that expected future income. At the start, people were paid on time, but by 1679, craftsmen were being paid up to 6 months late. By 1694, the arrears were so large that the commissioners agreed to pay 6% interest on the outstanding sums owed to the craftsmen. Now, another factor in the rebuilding was that Wren knew that the ground under St. Paul's was not particularly firm. So he actually deliberately laid out the new to avoid the old foundations as much as possible, knowing that his new foundations would need to be a lot broader than the old Gothic ones. So you can see the difference between the old shape and the new. Now, in Parentalia, which was written by Wren's son and published by his grandson in 1750, we are told of an incident that was taken notice of by some people as a memorable omen. When the surveyor had set out upon the place the dimensions of the great dome and fixed upon the centre, a common labourer was ordered to bring a flat stone from the heaps of rubbish, such as should first come to hand, to be laid for a mark and direction to the masons. The stone, which was immediately brought and laid down for that purpose, happened to be a piece of gravestone, with nothing remaining of the inscription but this single word in large capitals, Resurgam. Recent calculations have been used to show that the cathedral is actually aligned on sunrise of Easter Day 1675, shortly before the actual start of construction. However, this may simply be coincidence, or else perhaps a little bit of wishful thinking. For Parentalia goes on to say that the first stone of this basilica was laid in the year of 1675, implying that, as might be expected, the two events of the centering of the dome and the beginning of construction happened pretty close together. But actually, the cathedral accounts show that the center of the dome must have been set out as early as the summer of 1673, before the warrant design was actually approved, and that further work on setting out the east end according to the new model, and that is the great model, which was sort of the expansion of the Greek cross church, was actually done in 1674. In the first phase, up to 1685, Wren planned the cathedral with equal length nave and choir arms and single-story aisle walls. But soon after the accession of James II in 1685, when the cathedral's funding was increased, he enlarged the west end and to provide a library, or rather two libraries. And in his changed design, he also added in what are now known as the screen walls, upper aisle walls, to create an all-round two-story elevation beneath a more richly modelled dome, wider and higher than the one he had designed at the start of the work. This revised design of 1685-7, as it is now known, was partly inspired what Wren then knew from drawings and engravings of the domed church of Les Invalides in Paris, which had begun in 1677. But I thought that at this point, you might as well see inside the cathedral as it is today. This is actually a photo from a service in 2008. And here, taken from the West End, you can just see up here how you've got the beginning of a slight widening at the West End. Now, to be able to build, you need to have materials. A number of factors led to the selection of Portland stone that was used in the rebuilding. First were its natural properties. Portland stone is hard-wearing cream oolitic limestone. It's a freestone. It withstands polluted atmospheres well, can easily be carved to form crisp ornamentation. Secondly, the king owned the quarries at Portland, and so the stone carried royal associations. Inigo Jones had already used Portland stone for the banqueting house in Whitehall, and it had been extensively used for building other new buildings in the city after the Great Fire. Wren himself described it as Britain's finest building stone. Although interestingly, a modern geologist has said that Portland stone would never pass today's building regulations, as its finer properties only become apparent after lengthy exposure to air, and as freshly mined, it would fail most of today's building requirements. Anyhow, in 1675, the Commission for Rebuilding turned its attention to the problems of stone supply for the new cathedral. And in December of that year, they petitioned the king for the sole right to quarry Portland stone for use in the cathedral. The quarrymen, who had previously been allowed to dig stone from the common land on the island and sell it for their own profit, immediately objected to the awarding of exclusive rights to the cathedral. And they sent a letter of objection to the king on the 31st of December, 1675. But despite the objections, a royal warrant was issued in February 1676, granting the rights with all usual duties to be paid, and stating explicitly that no stone was to be removed unless with the permission of the king's surveyor for the king's use, such stone being exempt from duty. This last clause was open to interpretation. Wren saw it to mean that he, as surveyor of the king's works, had absolute control over the quarries, and that as the stone for the cathedral was granted to it by the king, it was for the king's use and was thus exempt from duty. Not surprisingly, that view was not shared by the islanders, who thought that the warrant granted Wren the right to use the stone, but as it was not for the king, duty should still be paid. To confuse the matter further, there is no doubt that the quarrymen had been taking stone from the royal quarries and selling it for their own profit. Wren, who is in London and close to the monarch, simply expected the quarrymen to do whatever they were told. But in doing so, he seriously underestimated the determination of the islanders to protect their livelihoods. And as a result, there was 35 years of almost continual dissent between Wren and the quarries, which on occasion broke out into open revolt. The royal warrant, issued in 1675, required the commissioners to appoint an agent to act on their behalf on the island. The first of these agents was the least successful. In anticipation of a warrant for the supply of stone being granted, the commissioners had already approached Thomas Knight in December 1675, and in February 1676, they provided him with a letter of introduction of formal contract. But the letter is particularly interesting because it includes a list of the shapes and sizes of stones needed to complete the first section of works, the rebuilding of the choir. So, St. Paul's, with its detailed building accounts, provide a clear insight into the problems of constructing a very large building in the late 17th century. Recent research has made interesting discoveries about the important part played by stone merchants, factors, and agents, all acting as middlemen in providing materials for projects such as St. Paul's. Explain why St. Paul's took so long to build. Because St. Paul's was forced to seek sources of facing stone beyond the Isle of Portland, because the available supplies simply could not meet demand. So let's see where the stone really came from. Burford, Headington, Reigate, Maidstone, Beer, Ketton, Caen, Guildford, and Tadcaster. These were all sources of stone which was actually used as facing stones in the building. Burford, if you remember, was the source of the stone for the Sheldonian. Now, wherever possible, stone was transported by water. Country roads were extremely primitive and then became virtually impassable when it rained. When stone had to be transported by road, it was ox carts which were used. Most stone actually began its journey from the quarry on some sort of cart, but you got it to the nearest possible river. If the stone arrived from the west, the last leg of the journey was from the 3 docks down below up the steep hill. From the records, it's quite clear that the carts there could only carry 2 tons of stone, equivalent to just 1 or 2 pieces of Portland stone, and less than some of the larger pieces which were quarried. One, John Slyford, had a monopoly on the carriage of goods up Ludgate Hill throughout the construction period, an enterprise from which he profited handsomely. But the bridge, London Bridge, provided a substantial obstacle to shipping, and any large ships had to offload before they got to London Bridge, and smaller boats were used to transport for the final section. Surprise, surprise, the last section of the journey was also controlled by John Slyford, who owned a wharf at Redriff Stairs. Here, ships docked and Slyford's cranes transshipped their cargoes into Slyford's boats, and the cost of transport and transshipment was a significant factor in the supply of much of the stone. For Portland stone, for instance, the cathedral paid for the smallest stones 10 shillings and 2 pence per tonne, and another 12 shillings per tonne for the shipping, as well as 3 shillings and 6 pence per tonne for barge transport and cartage from Redriff. So the total transport costs were greater than the cost of stone itself. Here, I'm just looking at some samples of the Portland stone, which is a white cream brown to pale brown tint when fresh, which becomes almost pearly white on exposure to air. But there were problems with the supply of stone from Portland, and in 1678, frustrated by lack of communication, the commissioners asked if there was a gentleman living close to the island who could go back and report on what was happening. Culprits were summoned to London who had destroyed one of the piers and threatened with incarceration until they returned to work and repaired the damages. But by this stage, rebuilding of the cathedral work had come to a standstill for want of the correct size of stones. Thomas Strong, among others, was ordered to go down to Portland immediately to inspect the situation. And the incompetent first agent was replaced by new ones. And from then on, a much more reliable supply of stone happened. But crisis did hit again in 1696 when Gilbert, who had been the agent for 15 years, and that's here, he died. And for a while, again, there was chaos over the supply of stone from Portland. So the other places, Burford stone. This is a creamy grey colour. You may remember when I was talking about the geology of stones earlier, I used Iffley Church in Oxford as one of the examples. And the Burford stone came, which was used by St. Paul's, came from the same quarry. It was owned by the Strong family. Now, it's not generally appreciated that as built, St. Paul's was actually a two-tone exterior, with Portland stone contrasted with Burford, Headington, and Ketton stone. The Headington freestone, which I'm looking at here, was used for ashlar walls, but unfortunately it splinters and crumbles away after a short period of time. There is now no external Headington, Burford or Ketton stone in St. Paul's. It was all replaced starting in 1782 by the then cathedral surveyor Robert Milne. I just find it ironic that it was the burning of coal, which had largely financed the cathedral, also forced the replacement of the two-tone exterior. Another stone used a lot, Reigate stone. Wren tried to use this first for vaulting in the crypt. But Reigate stone was actually very, very susceptible to frost. And so at St. Paul's, carpenters were made to build sheds in which the Reigate stone could be stored away from the weather. Labourers were paid for collecting the stone and putting it specifically into the sheds. While most of the vaulting in St. Paul's is actually made of brick, there are several references to Reigate stone being used in vaulting inside the cathedral, in the great stairs and in the vaults over the vestries. Another stone that was used was Kentish rag, and this was actually used particularly for staircases. It's important to note that the staircases were deliberately built very, very wide so that during the construction, two men could pass on the stairs while heavy laden. Beer stone was also used, and Ketton stone. and Caen, Burgate and Tadcaster. But these last stones were actually very little really used. And finally, rubble. Initially, all the rubble that was needed came from the old cathedral, but that had run out by 1685. Besides stone, there was also a constant need for timber. This is the only surviving illustration showing scaffolding, but timber was needed for scaffolding, for cranes, and also a constant supply of carpenters was needed. In Wren's time, people were paid in one of three ways: by day, by measure, or by grate. Early on, laborers were employed by day, but it must have been a meager existence for them, 6 days a week at 1 shilling and 4p a day. Payment by the day gave workmen no incentive to finish the job. So most of St. Paul's work was contracted and paid by measure, although later on some was even done by grate, which is a payment for completing a complete task. The big exception were the carpenters, who were always paid by day, and rather better than the labourers, at between 2 shillings and 6p and 3 shillings a day. And there were about 20 carpenters always on site from the beginning, and it increased as the amount of scaffolding increased. And at this point, I think it is time to say this will be concluded next week.